Welcome back, my fellow assassins, to another episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. So, I gotta ask you guys something. In your opinion, does context matter? If you answered yes, then you're like me. You think that context matters, and when someone gives you statistics or numbers, you need to have some context behind them. Otherwise, they're just basically pointless. Kind of one example of this is, say that I'm a car company, and I say that this car has a top speed of, say, 150 units of speed, where my competitor's car only has 100 units of speed as the top speed. And now you're probably thinking, okay, so obviously your car with the 150 units of speed is faster, but what the heck is a unit of speed? Are we talking kilometers per hour? Are we talking miles per hour? Are you an absolute madman, insane, and somehow you managed to break the laws of physics and you're talking about light years? So as you can see, context matters. And one thing that I think those in the technology space, specifically technology reviewers, lack is context. Now, they're really good at comparing the new stuff to the new stuff. So they're really good at comparing the latest Intel chips to the latest AMD chips to the latest Apple Silicon chips, and maybe one generation back to give you quote-unquote context. But aside from that, there's really no context there. And then another problem that they have is bias in tech media. Now, I'm sure you're all aware of the PCMR people or the PC Master Race people that are like, oh, Windows is the best and anything besides Windows is garbage. And you can build a gaming PC for way less than you can do blah, blah, blah. And then you have the Apple fanboys and the Apple sheep that literally bow down to everything that Apple does and can't say a bad thing about Apple. And even if Apple's, totally shafting them with something, they're still praising them. And they're like, thank you, sir, can I have another, kind of a thing. So you have the two extremes, and then you have the people that are in the middle. And the thing that kind of annoys me is there are some out there that will try to claim they're impartial, but if you really look and dig deeper into their coverage of things, you can tell that they're biased. And I think one of the biggest people that I know of that fall into this category is those over at LMG, or Linus Media Group. You're probably mostly familiar with their Linus Tech Tips channel. Now, don't get me wrong, I love me some Linus Tech Tips. I watch them quite frequently, and I enjoy their content. I think that their content is very well produced. Kind of should be, since they have a team over there that's like the size of a medium-sized media company. So, they're pretty good size over there. So it should be pretty good content. So it's very well produced. They're very thoughtful and meticulous in how they do stuff, and that's awesome. But the problem is they try to claim that they're unbiased and impartial when, if you watch enough of their videos, you really understand that they very much heavily favor Windows. Now, don't get me wrong, they're more than happy to criticize Windows and Microsoft and PC manufacturers, just like they're more than willing to praise Apple for things that they do right. But more often than not, when they're like reviewing an Apple product, for example, they're more often than not, you're going to get some kind of spin that tries to paint the Mac computer in a more negative light than, another reviewer would do, or especially more of a negative light than like an Apple sheep would do. So there's nothing wrong with this by any means. The problem that I have is they try to say that they're unbiased when they're clearly not. And they have so the biggest thing that they do is they have a habit of highlighting tests where Apple computers struggle to perform as well, specifically in gaming benchmarks, which we're going to get more into that in a moment. But compared to what they claim is a similarly priced gaming PC, which is, again, we're going to get more to this later on when we talk about benchmarks and comparisons and why context matters. But it's really not a fair comparison. Just because something is priced the same as something else doesn't mean comparing it in, apples to apples is necessarily a fair comparison. So now I went on here about talking about how people are biased and everything, and like everyone else, I'm biased, just as you're biased on a topic, and just like everyone in the world has their biases on certain topics. Unless they have absolutely zero understanding on a topic, then they're obviously not biased because, they don't know anything about the topic, so how can they be biased? But with that said, I should note that personally, I consider myself an Apple fan, right? I've mentioned on this podcast before that I currently record on a 2015 15-inch MacBook Pro. I love it. I own multiple Macs, and I generally I watch the Apple keynotes, and most of the time I enjoy the stuff they do. So I would consider myself to have a bias towards Apple. But with that said, I'm also not shy to call them out on it and call them out on their BS. For example, personally, I think the 24-inch iMac with the white bezels, I think it looks awful. It looks terrible in my opinion. Black bezels for the win, dark mode forever. I mean, maybe that's just because I'm a software developer, and if it's not dark mode, you're doing it wrong, and I like the black, but I don't know. I saw, my initial opinion when I saw that computer was, I was like, man, that looks terrible. I hate the white. And then, I watched some reviews from people that I know are, diehard Apple sheep, and they're like, oh, the white bezels are so amazing, and they're, drooling over this thing, and I'm like, no, it's not that great. I mean, not a fan. And then, I mentioned this, I know I've mentioned this in the past few episodes of the Dark Assassins podcast, where I mentioned how terrible I think the notch on the new MacBook Pros looks. I don't know why Apple did it, why they continue to add it, and I just think it looks dumb. So I just don't get it. And then later in the episode, we're going to talk about my dislike for their determination to make it as hard as possible for you to service your own devices and upgrade components yourself. But we'll get more into that in a moment. So I'm not afraid to call Apple out, but I will say in general, I am biased towards their products because I enjoy using them. But I'm also not afraid to call them out when I think it's warranted, which is, that goes a lot further than what other people do that try to claim that they're unbiased and give an quote-unquote impartial opinion. Now, of course, I try to be as impartial as possible, but obviously some of the bias does come out from time to time, just like anyone else's. But for information as a whole in technology, you can't rely on just one source for your information, right? So, if you're watching the news, you can't just rely on one source for information. So, in my opinion, if you're trying to get all your tech information from, say, Linus Tech Tips, for example, that's like saying, yeah, I get all my information from, CNN, or I get all my information from Fox News, so therefore I have a very diverse view and opinion on everything because they're impartial. And just so you're aware, if you think that CNN or Fox News is impartial, you have really drunk the Kool-Aid on that one, because they are definitely not. But that also goes to another point where just because you get your information from multiple sources doesn't mean that you're getting unbiased information, right? So if you're getting your tech news from 2 different Apple sheep channels, you're obviously not getting the full story. If you get all your tech news from 2 PC Master Race channels, you're obviously not getting the full story. Just like if you watch the news and you're getting all your news from, say, Fox News or the Daily Wire, you're not getting the full story. Similarly, if you only get your news from CNN or NBC, you're not getting the full story. So when you say that so if you really want the full story on tech, you got to go through multiple sources, multiple channels, get your news from all different sides. So just like I kind of mentioned, if you watch a review from someone that's a PC Master Race dieharder on, the latest Apple product, of course they're going to say it's bad and say you shouldn't buy it, and how building a PC is so much better than, this pile of junk that Apple's shipping out. Of course they're going to say that. Just like an Apple sheep reviewing an Apple product is going to goo goo gaga and drool all over it, even though it's might have some problems. So you got to make sure that you get both sides and you're not just getting all your tech advice and news from one source. So unfortunately, that means no. In the ideal smart world, you can't get all your tech advice from the Dark Assassins podcast. I know it's a real shame. It's terrible. I know, but if you want to follow good best practices, then ideally you should get your sources from multiple outlets. So going on to the next topic about kind of moving into the context matters. A lot of tech reviews. So going back to the Linus Tech Tip stuff when we talked about highlighting tests that Apple computers struggle compared to this quote-unquote similarly priced PC. One of the big problems with that is in their cases, they like to do a lot of gaming benchmarks, which credit to them, that's their audience. They know their audience. They're doing it for their audience. But at the same time, you're comparing and benchmarking a system for something it wasn't designed for. So, sure, you can build a purpose-built, race car that's going to smoke anything for the same price, but it's also not going to have the same creature comforts that, your regular sedan's going to have. It's not going to have the nice plush seats. It's not going to have CarPlay or Android Auto. It's not going to have, the nice interior, but it's going to be fast as heck. And if you're like, yeah, this one's better because it's faster, that's not really telling the whole story now, is it? So so that's why trying to build a purpose-built gaming PC for the same price as a Mac, comparing them and being like, oh, look, the gaming PC is faster in these gaming benchmarks, so therefore the gaming PC is better than the Mac. It's okay. But now imagine if I told you that the Ford F-150 is better than the Chevy Corvette objectively, not subjectively, but it is objectively better because it can tow 14,000 pounds and the Chevy Corvette can't. So therefore it's better. And they're both can be priced similarly, so therefore the F-150 is hands down better than the Corvette. Or on the other hand, you could be like, well, the Corvette's way better than the Ford F-150 because the Chevy Corvette absolutely smokes the F-150 in a 0 to 60 time. No dip Sherlock, that's the point of each one of them, right? The Corvette was built to be, a fast car. It's a sports car for a reason. It's not built to tow things, just like the Ford F-150 is built to tow things. It's not built to be, a fast race car with blazing fast speeds. So if you mean to tell me that this purpose-built system absolutely obliterates, a competitor, which really an F-150 and a Corvette aren't even competitors in general, but for the sake of this comparison, if you're saying this purpose-built thing to do this one thing is better than this other one, well, yeah, of course it is, because that's the whole point of it. So trying to say this gaming computer is better at gaming than a Mac is ludicrous. Yeah, of course, no dip Sherlock, it is. And honestly, anyone with a brain cell, a single brain cell, just one, you only need one. If you're planning on buying a gaming computer or a gaming machine or building your own or whatever, you're not even thinking about buying a Mac, let alone cross-shopping one. So trying to do gaming benchmarks on a Mac versus a purpose-built gaming PC with the best graphics card on the market and, the best CPU on the Intel CPU on the market that's purpose-built for gaming, yeah, of course it's going to beat the Mac because that's what it's designed to do. Macs in general aren't designed for gaming. Now, I understand in recent years, Apple's trying to have this big gaming push, like, oh, you can game on the Mac. You can't game on the Mac. I mean, sure, if you're trying to be a casual gamer, like you don't really care too much about, high FPS and all that stuff, yeah, you can game on a Mac, sure. But if no one buying a Mac is buying it for the sole purpose of gaming. I don't care if Apple's trying to push that. No one's doing it. No one with the brain cell is doing it, okay? So you can't really compare gaming metrics on a Mac and a PC and use that to say that one is better than the other. It's just not a fair comparison. So another one that we can kind of compare is, say we compare that same $4,000 gaming PC that the Linus Tech Tips did in their comparison between it and the Mac Studio. So say we're comparing that to a $4,000 rack-mounted server like that Enterprise would use. Of course the $4,000 gaming PC is going to absolutely destroy the rack-mounted server in a gaming test. That doesn't mean that it's better than the server. The server has its use case, just like the gaming PC has its use case. Just like the Ford F-150 versus the Corvette, they both have their use cases. It's all about use cases, so don't be comparing two completely different use cases for machines and try to, equate them and be like, yep, because of this one's better. Like, it just doesn't work. Like, if you're buying a Ford F-150, you're not buying it because its 0 to 60 time is out of this world. You're buying it because its towing capacity is good. You're not buying a Chevy Corvette because it can tow a lot. You're buying it because it's fast and it looks cool. But, that is what it is. And the other problem that a lot of these reviewers have is, here's where we start getting into the context. They compare current gen stuff versus maybe one generation back, and that's about it. So what does this mean? So they'll compare, say, the latest Intel chip to the latest AMD chip to the latest Apple Silicon chip, and then they might, depending on which one they're comparing, say they're comparing, a Mac compared to these devices. They might compare, say they're doing the M2 comparison. The M2 just recently got released. They'll compare the M2 to the M1 to the latest Intel chip to the latest AMD chip, and that's it. Now, that's cool, but there's no context there. I don't know what these numbers mean. You can tell me that this scores, 1,500 in Cinebench. It's like, okay, but where's my point of reference for that? Like, for example, imagine kind of going back to the whole units example we mentioned earlier. Like, this thing went 55 units far and this one went 60 units far. Okay, but is that in feet? Is that in meters? Like, I don't have a point of reference for how far 55 units of distance is. I just don't. If you're saying this material got to 100 degrees hot and this one got to 98 degrees hot, it's like, okay, but is that Kelvin? Is that Celsius? Is that Fahrenheit? Because 100 degrees Fahrenheit is a heck of a lot different than 100 degrees Celsius or 100 degrees Kelvin. So if you don't give me that point of reference and those units so I can actually understand and comprehend what your data means, it's meaningless. And I understand that all these tech reviewers that are on Tech Twitter, which is basically an echo chamber dumpster fire, which of course that's what all Twitter is. Now, granted, I don't have Twitter, but since it's an echo chamber dumpster fire, there's a good reason for it. And I think a lot of people that kind of look at Twitter from the outside, and really all social media in general, really understand that it's kind of just this dumpster fire and an echo chamber. But regardless, because it's this echo chamber, all those on tech Twitter get caught up in the hype that everyone is constantly on the latest and greatest because all the posts they see are from their fellow creators talking about, oh yeah, I'm on the M2 now, or I just bought the latest M1 Ultra chip, or, I just bought this, I just got the 3090 or TI, or, it's like, the average consumer and the average person is not upgrading to the latest and greatest every year. We don't have the money to it, number one. And two, we're more than happy with the performance we currently have. Heck, I'm talking about how I'm recording this podcast on a 2015 15-inch MacBook Pro. This computer's 7 years old. It's more than powerful enough for the majority of the stuff that I do. Like, I really don't need to upgrade. And another computer that I own is a 2012 Mac Mini that I do a lot of just kind of my generic everyday computing stuff on, right? Like web browsing, watching videos, doing like graduate school work, things like that. Like, it's more than adequate for what I do, right? So like, I don't need to be on the latest and greatest. And I think a lot of you are probably the same way. Like, unless your sole job is reviewing the latest tech products, you're not going to be on the latest and greatest. So having all these reviewers spew at you the latest and greatest compared to last year's latest and greatest really doesn't mean anything to you unless you recently upgraded your machine and are on, last year's latest and greatest, which granted you might be because the machine you upgraded from was 10 years old, or 5 years old, but most people aren't upgrading every year. And the problem is when you're comparing new tech to 1-year-old tech, it's just kind of a bunch of noise because you're not giving any context for, what these numbers that you're giving actually mean. So let's run through a scenario here and try to give you a better understanding of what I'm talking about. So say I am a tech YouTuber and I am comparing Apple's latest chips, right? So we're talking about the M1 I guess technically the M2 is out, but we're talking, for simplicity, we're talking M1, M1 Pro, and M1 Max, since those are the chips found in the MacBook Pros. So say I'm a tech YouTuber and I'm reviewing them. So all of these numbers for reference are from cpubenchmark.net, just for that point of clarity. So I'm not just, making these numbers up or pulling them out of my butt. So for the base M1 that has the 8-core CPU, you're looking at 14,637 for its score. The base M1 Pro with the 8-core CPU rather than the 10-core scores 17,393. The 10-core M1 Pro, on the other hand, scores 22,220, and the M1 Max, which only has a 10-core CPU, scores 22,450. Now, cool. We can obviously see that the M1 has a 14,637. I mean, that's a high number. Not sure the context of that, but I can respect that it's a high number. And then we can see that the base M1 Pro is over 17,000, so it's, a decent amount better, decent amount higher scoring. And then we can see yet again the 10-core M1 Pro scores even better than the 8-core, which, you'd expect since you have more cores on the same generation of chip, so it makes sense why it's better. And we can see that between the higher-end Pro chip and the Max, they score basically the same because they're running the same cores. So, that makes sense. So if we go into the numbers of that, we can see that the base M1 Pro scores 20% higher than the M1. The higher-end M1 Pro, which is the 10-core versus the 8-core, the 10-core scores 28% higher than the 8-core, and then the M1 Max scores 1% higher than the 10-core M1 Pro, which is, statistically, it's not significant. So, cool. We can obviously, see the improvement in performance, but if you're not on one of those latest chips, that doesn't have any real significance to you. There's no context for you. You have no units of measurement. You don't understand, are we talking, like going back to, the heat example, are we talking in Fahrenheit? Are we talking Kelvin? Are we talking Celsius here? Like, I don't have a point of reference for that. So let's take my machine here, the 2015 15-inch MacBook Pro. So it's a top of the line spec for its time. It came with comes with the i7 4980HQ, which was the top chip that was offered in this computer. So now, with this in mind, if we go again to CPUbenchmark.net, we see that this chip specifically, scores 6,736. So here we can clearly see how big of a difference in performance that is compared to the new chips. And see, this is why context matters, because I don't have a new M1 chip, so I don't really understand how much 20% faster than the M1 really is. But what I can see is my computer right now that scores 6,736 is obviously a heck of a lot lower than 14,637. And this is where context comes in, and which a lot of people in the tech space, specifically the tech YouTube space, leave out and kind of ignore and don't put into their data and charts. Now, I understand that you're probably going to say, well, if they put in a bunch of old devices, that would really clog up their graphs and make it hard to read, which I agree with you. You're 100% right. But at the same time, would adding 2 machines in there, that are slightly older, to give you a little more context for those of us that have older machines, would that really make your graph that much messier? I don't think so. So now that we kind of talked about these numbers, let's run into the context a little bit more. So we can see how big the gains are. So if we compare my MacBook Pro here compared to the M1, so my MacBook currently scored 6,736, and the M1 scored 14,673. So the M1 scores 117% higher than my current MacBook Pro, and the base M1 Pro with the 8-core CPU scores 158% higher than my current MacBook Pro. And the 10-core M1 Pro scores 230% higher than my MacBook Pro. And the M1 Max scores 233% higher. So with these numbers, it really gives me a sense of how much better performance I can expect compared to what I currently have. And that honestly helps, because seeing that the M1 Pro is the base M1 Pro was 20% faster than the M1. Cool, but that doesn't really mean much. But if we look here, we can see the M1 is just over double what the performance of my current machine is, whereas the M1 Pro would be 2.5 times the performance increase. So now I can start to see, okay, do I really need the 2.5 times increase, or would the 2 times be accurate? Or heck, do I need 3 times the performance and I need to spring for the M1 Pro or the M1 Max? Having this context of where older machines lie to the latest and greatest really helps us consumers that aren't caring about upgrading literally every year, like those in the tech space, helps us get a better sense of what we need to suit our needs. So, then of course it comes down to how much storage and how much RAM you want, and you can decide that yourself. But that's a lot easier to judge, because if you're saying, oh yeah, my current machine has 16 gigs of RAM and that's more than enough than what I need, so I don't need any more than that. That's easy to tell. Same thing with, your storage. If you have a 512 gig SSD, for example, and you're running out of space, then maybe on your next computer you get a terabyte. You can easily view those stages of what you need to upgrade. But CPUs and GPUs, for that matter, is a lot harder, because a lot of the reviewers are only benchmarking them and comparing them to, fellow latest specs. They don't compare them to the older specs like what your machine would have, which is kind of where the problem is. So kind of putting into more context with older machines better helps you to understand what you need. Just like we talked about, if you have 16 gigs of RAM, if 16 gigs is going to be enough, or if you need to go for 32 or a 64, whatever the case may be. So if you know that this machine, say for example in the case of the M1 compared to my machine, is over twice the speed of my current machine as far as CPU performance goes, then maybe that's enough for me to be like, yeah, that's more than enough power than what I need. I'll just go with that and save, a couple $1,000. Or maybe I'm like, twice the speed is good, but I kind of need a little bit more. So maybe I'll spring for that base M1 Pro. And that's where this context matters of having the older systems, and why I think it's key and definitely a problem that Tech YouTube needs to address. And another problem Tech YouTube needs to stop addressing is their overemphasis on video editing. Now, I completely understand the point of tech reviewers and Tech YouTube is video editing. That's literally their job. So I understand why there's a huge emphasis on video editing. But to the vast majority of people, are you really video editing that much? I mean, maybe like once a year, like if you go on a family vacation and you took a bunch of pictures and videos and you want to compile it into like one movie to like, recap the whole thing, like sure, you might do some video editing, but like you're not doing it, like, these YouTubers are. Like, you don't really care a ton about that. Like how often are you rendering and exporting 8K H.265 ProRes video? Never? Rarely? You have no idea what the heck the word salad I just said even meant? I mean, that's basically the point. You're probably not doing it that often. So the benchmarks that they give about how much better your export times will be really doesn't mean that much. And again, kind of what we were mentioning on for the past few minutes, they're benchmarking their export times against last year's chips and last year's devices. They're not benchmarking it against the system that you have that's like 5, 7, 10 years old. So sure that this chip, or with this computer, it exported in 2 minutes and 30 seconds compared to last year's that exported it in 3 minutes. Okay, but how much better is that than my machine? Good question. They didn't answer it, did they? So that's why I think they really need to start bringing in some older devices into their reviews and comparison videos. And I think probably the last thing that I think they hype on too much is upgradability and repairability. Now, before I actually get into this, I need to preface this by saying I 100% support right to repair and you being able to work on your own system and upgrade it how you want it. After all, you bought the machine, it's your property, you own it. You should be able to service it and upgrade it as you please. And as I've mentioned before on this podcast, I am an avid home labber. I love tinkering with technology, upgrading computers, upgrading servers, taking them apart, putting them together, swapping in and out parts. I love that stuff. But personally, I don't think the vast majority of people care. Like, I'm just being honest. I don't think the vast majority of people care. Your grandma doesn't care if she can upgrade the RAM in her computer after she bought it. She just wants a computer that works. She doesn't care if she can throw a new SSD in there 10 years from now or after she buys it, rather than paying for the upgrade to happen, doing the upgrade herself. She really doesn't care. Now, that's not to say people that never intended to upgrade or service their own computers wouldn't see the fact that they can't upgrade and service their own computers as a downside. But I can almost guarantee you that that's not going to be a deal breaker for them. They're not going to care. So people that like to harp on how bad a product is because you can't use or service it or upgrade it, it's, don't get me wrong, a 100% valid argument, and I agree with you. You're 100% right. it should be upgradable. It shouldn't be this locked down. Looking at you, Apple, locking down all your devices, not allowing us to upgrade RAM and SSDs anymore. But is it really that big of a game changer and a deal breaker for people that just want a computer that works, that they can browse the internet, write Word documents, compile code? Do they really care if they can, down the line, add more RAM to it? Probably not. Like, I just don't think they care that much. But like I said, I think that more manufacturers should kind of go the route, maybe not to the extent that Framework is going, which if you're not familiar with Framework, they're basically a company that makes like 100% modular systems that you can upgrade and replace basically everything on the device for pretty reasonable prices. So I don't think necessarily that every company has to go the Framework route, but I would really like to see more companies like Apple and Microsoft and other manufacturers add more upgradability and serviceability to their machines without kind of twisting your arm and like trying to convince you not to, and making it just like unobtainable to like, service your system. Like, I know when Apple came out with their, service repair for like, individuals for like the iPhone, they came out with that in the past couple months or so. There's a lot of pushback on it because you're not really saving any money doing the repair yourself, and you're also liable for if anything goes wrong, which in that sense, it almost dissuades people from, wanting to do the repairs themselves. Whereas if, the prices or the parts were cheaper and more affordable, people might be more inclined to do it themselves. So I 100% think that companies should strive to make their products more repairable, more serviceable by the end user, and more upgradable by the end user. But personally, I also don't really think that the vast majority of people care. They just want a machine that works. So the reviewers that try to hold repairability and upgradability against a product and why you shouldn't buy it, while I 100% agree with you, and that's a valid argument, I also don't think that con necessarily weighs as high in the minds of the average consumer as, say, how much RAM it has or how much storage it has or how fast it is. I really don't think that that's going to be as big of a deal breaker for them. So we spent the whole episode here just talking about, how out of touch tech reviewers are, and we kind of touched on some solutions, but what are the actual solutions here? Because you can go on and on complaining about stuff, but if you don't have any solutions, where are you really going with it? So, as mentioned before, and as I've harped on for this entire episode, comparing against older hardware, not just the latest and greatest. Now, you don't have to compare, the latest M1 to a 2003 desktop or laptop running Windows XP. Obviously, that's kind of a bit out there. But I would say at least go back, 5 years, 7 years, since I think a lot of people, that's kind of what they're upgrading from. They're not upgrading from, a 1 or 2 year old device. They're upgrading from, maybe a 10-year-old device, maybe a 5-year-old device, maybe a 7-year-old device. And I think those upgrade times are honestly going to get a lot further apart now that systems in general becoming a lot more capable and powerful. Like this idea that you can run a 10-year-old system and it's still fine. You go back to, 10 years ago from 2012. In 2012, you wouldn't really think of running a system from like 2000 or 2002 in 2012. Like that thing would be slow as heck. But you're talking about like running a machine from 2012 or even like 2010 or 2009, and it's still being more than capable in 2022. I mean, that's just unheard of, and it's only, getting better from the consumer end. Like you could probably buy, like if you want, so going back to the M1 example, you could probably buy like an M1 device and be set for at least 10 years, if not even more than that. And honestly, the only reason you'd even consider upgrading was because your device lost support. I mean, they're more than capable of running and doing great things for a long time. And I think probably one of the main reasons that people upgrade, like I said, was for software support. So I think if you wanted at the worst case, at the least, you should probably do benchmark comparisons against the oldest supported hardware for a system. So, specifically for like Mac reviews, for example, compare the latest and greatest to like a 2018 or a 2017 computer, a Mac computer. So if you're comparing MacBook Pros, like if you're comparing the M1 Pro, MacBook Pro, say compare it to like a 2017 MacBook Pro, which is, I believe, the oldest supported one. And, that would give some people more context, because some people that have those machines, or heck, an even better solution would be compare it against things that just got dropped from software support, because those are really the people that would be like, well, my computer is not supported anymore, so I'll probably need to upgrade. How much performance am I really going to get here? And I think if you really want the best and be able to be the most inclusive for as many people with your testing, you want to include at least one generation back from being supported. So in the case of the MacBook Pros, the 2017s were the latest supported, so maybe go back to the 2016s or the 2015s. Compare those against the latest and greatest and give people more of a perspective of how their machine compares to the latest and greatest, so they can have a better understanding of how much performance they actually need and how much money they really need to spend to get the performance they want. And another thing that I think they need to focus on is do more real-world testing. I mean, sure, they continue doing the beloved Cinebench, Geekbench, and all those benchmarks that they love to run, and their video export tests, but include more real-world tests, right? Like, for us software developers, we want to know code compile times. We want to know how much performance increase in compile times we're going to get. If you're the average user, you want to know how quickly your applications are going to launch, or how quickly your web page is going to load, or how quick your storage is. Like, is your disk speed going to be faster, and by how much? What kind of a performance increase can you get by that? So I think the thing we have to keep in mind is, unless you're in the tech media and tech Twitter, you're not upgrading your system every year, and these comparisons of the upgrades that they portray to you don't really mean much, because you really have no context whatsoever for how your machine compares to the latest and greatest. So, yeah, that was a rant. That was a long rant of me complaining. Hopefully you got some value out of this, and it wasn't just me rambling for however long this episode is. But I hope that I doubt anyone from Tech Twitter or Tech YouTube is going to listen to this podcast. But if they do, hopefully we start seeing a change in reviews, and start seeing some incorporation of older devices into their reviews, to give us consumers that aren't upgrading our systems every single year more perspective of how our machines compare, or something close to our machines compared to the latest and greatest, so we can make better decisions. So if you enjoyed this episode, I'd ask that you leave a rating and review, and subscribe to this Dark Assassins podcast if you haven't done so already. Also, be sure to share with a friend or family member, or anyone that you think would like to hear how to make tech media and tech YouTube better than what it is right now. And if you have any questions, leave a rating and review for me, or you can email me your questions at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. There is a link in the show notes below, and if you ask me a question, it might end up on a future episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. So that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bool nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.